Hey everyone, Elia here. This is a conversation with Amos Goldberg, Professor of Holocaust History at the Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And he's the author of the books Trauma and First-Person Diary Writing During the Holocaust and You Shall Remember 5 Critical Readings in Holocaust Memory, as well as the co-editor of the Holocaust and the Nakba, a new grammar of trauma and history. I wanted to have Professor Goldberg on for two reasons. First, he's been among the most vocal Israeli historians of the Holocaust to have called Israel's actions in Gaza genocide. And secondly, he wrote a paper in 2024 on how the question of intent is used in discussions around genocide, including this one in Gaza. This is a rather long conversation, so I divided it up in two parts. If you're listening to this on the public feeds, know that you can listen to the full conversation already on Patreon, and that's on patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. The link is in the show notes. Otherwise, you just need to wait for a week or so, and I'll be releasing part 2. In part 1, we got into the paper, of course, so this question of intent, how is it used in legal studies versus how is it used in history, including on the Holocaust as well as other genocides. We got into the case study that he uses in his classes related to Hitler's Reichstag speech in 1939, and how is this relevant to how this question of intent that I just mentioned is usually talked about. We got into this concept of self-defense and how it is actually pretty common for states or the most powerful actor in a genocide to claim self-defense as precursor to starting the genocide. We also got into how the memory of the Holocaust is sometimes used to exclude other genocides, including this one in Gaza, and how the Holocaust can actually be used to better understand other genocides, whether it's the one in Bosnia in the 90s or Rwanda in the 90s as well, of course Myanmar a few years ago, or Gaza today. If you're interested, I recommend listening to episode 172, which I recorded with Daniel Foskoboynik, entitled The Holocaust, the Nakba, and Reparative Memory on this specific topic. Finally, at the end of part 1, we started talking about a warning that Professor Goldberg had in his paper, in which he said that if the question of intent, which is dominated by legal discourse, ends up dominating the field of history, and especially the field of Holocaust and genocide studies, it can set us back decades. And it's with that question that we start part 2 as well. So when you get by the end of that episode, know that you can already listen to the full episode, as I mentioned, on Patreon. That's on patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. One last thing. This is obviously, given the topic that we get into, not an easy episode. So take your time with it if that's what you need to do. There's certainly no shame in that. I did my best, as I tend to do on this podcast, to be as nuanced as possible and to give as in-depth of a conversation, let's say, to do it justice. And on that note, all that's left for me to say is that if you want to support this podcast as well as all of the other podcasts on the From the Periphery Media Collectives network, the best way to do so is to head out to that same Patreon link that I already mentioned. That is patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. And with the donation for as little as $5 a month, you can help us get to a point where we can actually support ourselves financially in doing these important projects. As always, thank you for listening, everyone, and take care.
First of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's an honor to listen to some of the episodes, and I mean, actually quite a lot, and it's a very fascinating podcast, so I'm really happy and honored. So my name is Amos Goldberg, and I'm a historian at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, specializing mostly on Holocaust and genocide studies. I would say that I have like 3 main topics. One is the Jewish experience during the Holocaust, Holocaust memory, and debates on Holocaust and genocide studies and the integration between Holocaust and genocide, or genocide and Holocaust. We might encounter those issues down the road in this podcast. But since January 2024, I became more and more vocal against the war and the genocide. I've written quite a lot about that, and not quite a lot, but I've written and interviewed and tried to in Hebrew and also in other languages. So I think this is good for now. I'm also a fellow at the Van Leer Institute at Jerusalem.
Thank you so much for joining me on this conversation. It's not going to be a light one, and I do appreciate you taking the time to do this. I've been familiar with your work since you co-edited the book that we'll probably get into towards the end of this conversation, called The Holocaust and the Nakba, which is it's relevant and to some extent to what we're going to be discussing as well. But we'll get into that later. I reached out to you after reading a paper that you published, I believe last year, in the Journal of Genocide Research and the title of that is The Problematic Return of Intent. And the question of intent has been something that I've also seen brought up time and time again in conversations related to the genocide in Gaza. And I will, of course, link the paper in the show notes. And I should say that this was part of a broader forum on Israel-Palestine, the subtitle of which is Atrocity, Crimes, and the Crisis of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Can you start with telling us a bit about that paper? Like, what was on your mind while you were writing it and what was the intention?
Yes, first of all, yes, we have to thank and appreciate the Journal of Genocide Research and its chief editor, Professor Dirk Moses, for initiating this forum that by now I think contains more than 24 or something that papers on the topic you just mentioned, which is actually reflecting on vis-a-vis the Gaza genocide, reflecting in the October 7th. In the events of October 7th, 2023, the atrocities and the massacre, reflecting vis-a-vis them and what happened since on the ways we understand this field and the way it functions and what can we learn about it and its relation to what is called the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, quote unquote, which is a conflict, as we know, is not the right word, but for the sake of this conversation. And I think first of all, it's about time that not only Gaza, but the Palestinian Nakba will be integrated into this field, because whether it's an ongoing event of ethnic cleansing and mass atrocities, and maybe a special case, but still a case of settler colonialism, and now full-scale genocide as I see it, and as many others see it. So it should be integrated, and somehow it was, excluded from the topic and from the field of genocide studies or mass atrocity studies. But it belongs there, and this is the first, I think, achievement of this forum. They already integrates it in relation to the components of this field, the discourse, and discussions. They're all short essays, and I really recommend to go and see, because some of them, I think all of them are very good. I wanted to say that there is a discrepancy between what we understand as genocide in disciplines of history and sociology and how law views this. And I wanted to, we all feel it, all those who work in the field feel it, because the word genocide comes from the legal field, because it's a crime. And a lawyer named a Jewish Polish lawyer who fled Poland after the invasion of the Nazis and ended up in America, he coined it. He coined it as a legal term. On the other hand, he himself was also kind of historian of this term and wrote quite a lot about previous genocide. And you see that the legal term and the historical, sociological, political phenomena are not the same. There's a gap between them. Can maybe explain it a little bit more, because the legal term was also discussed in various circles, particularly between 1946 and 1948 in the UN. Until December 1948, the Genocide Convention, what we call the Genocide Convention, which is the convention to prevent and punish the crime of genocide, was adopted by the UN, by the General Assembly. But those 2 years of discussion, there were all kinds of understandings and suggestions how to define this. But they ended up on a very narrow definition, mostly because of political reasons, because it was a power game between mostly America and Soviet Union. They had their interests, so they formed a kind of a definition which put great emphasis on intent. And it is, if you allow me to quote, I will quote exactly what the relevant, it says, Article 2 of the convention said, in a present convention, genocide means any of the following acts, and then there are 5 acts, committed, and this is what we have to emphasize, with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. There was the intent to destroy as such, as we see, put special emphasis on the issue of intent. But when we look historically on the annihilation of people or collectives, whether nations or even social groups that are not mentioned in the in the convention, we can't say it's not genocide because we can't prove the intent in this intent to kill as such as the convention says. We have the same historical phenomena, but maybe we didn't find the documents or whatever to show special intent. And it's not also important because the political, historical, social phenomena is quite the same if we want to talk to understand it. And in Holocaust history, there was a big debate in the 80s and the 90s between two big schools. One put really especially on intent, on anti-Semitic intent, to understand the Nazis acting out of intent. And the other was a functionalist school that didn't put such great emphasis on intent, but on some kind of functions and bureaucracy and other mechanism that many times local initiatives that altogether are compiled into what we call now the final solution. And both were legitimate. Since then, we really moved forward to develop very sophisticated explanations of various forms of mass violence, ethnic cleansing, genocide. Boundaries between those phenomena are not very clear. And if we stick to the very high bar of the definition, I don't know if we will be able to talk on most of those events because they do not necessarily fall with this very strict definition. And moreover, we will not understand the phenomena, the political, historical, social phenomena. And we have to reduce the explanation and the understanding of this phenomena, historical phenomena, to just intent in this strict way. I would say reduce the whole richness, intellectual richness of the field. And I spoke about this tension between the legal and where it takes us, because now we are all just looking many of us are, how to explain against, but where is the intent in Gaza? And we all focus more and more on intent because of the legal procedures that are taking place in the ICJ. And that will distort us from actually seeing and understanding what is happening in Gaza and why genocide and such atrocities happen in our modern world.
You make, I think, very eloquently in the piece the distinction between how, as you mentioned now, how the legal field talks about intent and how historians, including of the Holocaust and of genocide more broadly, talk about genocide. You start, and this really caught my attention, of course, because in the paper itself, you start with I suppose, fairly famous or infamous moment in history, which is Hitler's Reichstag speech in end of January 1939, because in that he talks about, I don't have the quote in front of me, but like the destruction of European Jews or something along those lines. I'm paraphrasing here. And there have been, as you mentioned, two positions around that speech as an example. One that focuses a lot on intent, as in like this proves that like as early as 1939, the Holocaust was basically on the way, i.e. that's what they wanted to do and that's it. And the other one, as you mentioned, kind of a more functionalist school, focused more on, it's not that even if one can demonstrably prove intent or not, is not necessarily the main question. It's more like what are the conditions that led to, well, what we call the Holocaust, the final solution and so on. And what I found really interesting is that you said, okay, there are these two positions, but you've noticed, especially since October, a kind of a shift, at least with some of the people that you've witnessed, or like Israelis especially, that you've talked to or witnessed or whatnot. Can you explain a bit, before we get into the Israelis specifically, why that speech is so central to your argument?
The question is, when was the Holocaust, or the final solution, which means the complete annihilation of the Jews in Europe, was decided on, is a question that preoccupied the field for many decades. Yeah. And at the beginning, there was an intuition, already in the 20s when he wrote Mein Kampf and his second book, that was clearly on his mind after the First World War. And it just waited and it developed and it waited for the right moment to execute it. But then when people started dwelling more into it, we see that it is not true, because until they reached the final solution, there were many other solutions. During the 30s in Germany, they tried to encourage Jews to emigrate, not to be killed. They didn't want to keep them until the right moment they will come and they will kill them. No, they pushed them away and they encourage. And then you see what at the beginning of the war, several territorial solutions, quote unquote, taking them to this, like Lublin to Nisco, place Nisco, moving, pushing them, or beyond or even to Madagascar. There was an idea, or deep into the Soviet Union. Those were all not what we know now as final solution, quote. So we see that there was no plan to kill the Jews until mid-end 1941 at the earliest. Now, in January 1939, Hitler makes a big speech to celebrate 6 years of being in power since 1933 in the Bundestag, in the parliament. And it's a very long speech. It's like 2 hours and a half, and it's a very anti-Semitic speech. But But this is not the main. I would say a main issue. He talks about all the achievements in foreign policy and reviving the nation, the army, so on and so forth, making Germany great again. And at the end, he reaches the straightforward, like it is all very anti-Semitic, or much of it is anti. But at the end, he comes to the Jewish issue, and he says that if the Jews will push the nations into a world war, not the annihilation of the world will be the outcome, but the annihilation of the Jewish race, something like that. That's January 1939. Many at the beginning said, oh, come, here we have a clear intent, a planned intent to kill the Jews. But you see, as I said afterwards, it's January 39. And only in June 1941, like 2.5 years later, which is quite a lot, only then there's the beginning of a mass killing, and it will take probably a few months, maybe a half a year, till it is all somehow, quote unquote, crystallized, or to what we call the final solution, which is a plan to kill each and every Jew in Europe and perhaps even beyond. So how can we put this together? It's the first time in January 1939 that Hitler talks publicly and about annihilating the Jews, but we don't see anything happening afterwards. So on the contrary, as I said, the Nazis come up with the territorial plans and nothing works for them at that point. So how can we put these two together? And historians try to confront this question. And one line of thought was, yes, there was no plan, but you could see it's the first time you can see what is really in his head. So it's, again, the intent. And the other one says, no, it's politics. That 1938 was, since 1938, they became very, very aggressive with the Jews. They tried to push them out of Germany and the Anschluss, like also Austria, that they annexed. And the Jews were identified with the refugee problem at that time. And they were negotiating, particularly with America, how many Jews they will accept. So he wanted to push. And as I said, the accumulative radicalization came throughout the war, but he has nothing really, he's not serious. Let's put it this way. He's vicious, he's racist, I can't say anything good, but it's just a matter within the negotiation, he decided to raise the bar much higher in his rhetoric. I'm paraphrasing, okay. So those are two lines of thoughts. And usually when I bring it to class, Israeli Jewish students tend to identify with the first, because the Israeli education, but also not Israeli education, and I'm not saying anything bad about this line of thought. We tend to explain the Holocaust by the issue of anti-Semitism, like seeing anti-Semitism, which makes it unique, that's a problem, disconnected from other forms of racism and other forms of violence, and mass violence and genocide. The other explanation always seems kind of weird to my students. Why not take him face value? He says what he thinks. Why not? This year, it was not a class, but a group of students, not a class, but a group of research students. My impression here, and maybe I was wrong, but that was my impression, that they were much more willing to accept this kind of a functionalist approach that says, no, it's just within the negotiation. And yes, it is a radicalization. And, like 8 months down the road, he will open the Second World War. But you don't have to take him by his word. It's just a matter of radicalizing his rhetoric within some kind of political context. And I saw that many are more willing to accept this year. And I connected it. I thought it was because this was actually the case in the ICJ and the genocide in Gaza case, because countless genocidal expressions in Israel after the 7th of October. In Israel, when it came to the ICJ, said, no, don't take us by the word. Those are not intentional genocidal utterances. What it is, it's an expression of anger, of rage, and after such a blow. And don't take words face value. And I thought that maybe Israeli Jews are more willing, because they don't want to be accused in genocide, they are more willing to accept this kind of explanation, because it takes us off the hook. Nobody can deny there were such a horrible dehumanization and genocidal, there was such a rhetoric, but it didn't mean anything except for rage and trauma and so on. And I thought that was an interesting anecdote. And again, it's an impression. Maybe I'm wrong, but I had the impression that something changed, because people look different on history because of their subject position and their existential unease with the accusation of genocide, which they wanted to brush away as Israel denied completely. 99% of the Israelis till now don't want to, even those who acknowledge atrocities would not say it's a genocide. And that was a kind of a way to say, don't take words seriously.
I've had a similar impression, not necessarily through direct interactions per se, or not as much, certainly, but just by virtue. I do cultural studies and media studies, so just looking at how media discourses in general have been covering the ongoing genocide since October and onwards. It kind of seems to me like a lot of the discourse has revolved around this misunderstanding, or at least even at times purposeful distortions of the importance of intent, which we've already discussed. And the debate, if it's not really much of a debate, but seems less to be about the actual acts committed by the Israeli armies, Israeli government and its military. Because in my experience, most of the time they don't even discuss the details of certain acts, like military acts. They keep it broad. They talk about this is what the Israeli reports suggest. This is what the Israeli military has said. They claim this, they claim that. So it's very much unless they're doing a very specific investigation, it's kept rather abstract or rather vague. In that context, the notion of intent it's very easy to say, well, this cannot be genocide because of X, Y, and Z. They can easily say things like, well, Israel has allowed aid from time to time. They wouldn't do that if it was genocide. Or they say, they have said, we do not want to harm civilians. And if they were doing a genocide, well, surely they wouldn't say that. And and stuff like that. And this seems to work with with many people. It seems to have the desired effect, I suppose. And part of that, and this is a more of a parenthesis than necessarily something to get into as much, but I just wanted to say it anyway. I think part of the reason has to do with how genocide are usually imagined in the popular imagination, how they usually talked about, how they usually conceptualized, especially in movies or TV series, which is the most readily available imagery for most people, more so than reading a speech, right, or the transcript of a speech, or even historical footage or what have you. I think it's a bit silly, but even Captain America or Indiana Jones punching Nazis, or the stormtroopers in Star Wars, pretty cartoonishly evil characters basically. And for the most part, it tends to be reduced to that when a lot of people in any case think about World War II. And if you have that in mind, or if this is kind of the easiest thing that one sort of withdraws from one's own imagination when they think about, let's say, a genocide, it's much harder to think of, let's say, I don't know, the Armenian genocide. Not because there weren't cartoonishly evil characters in that story as well, there were, but it's further back in the past. There aren't as much media or movies or what have you that you can easily associate certain symbols of the Ottoman Empire as readily as you would, for example, a swastika. So it's much more present in our imagination. And this has to do historically with because it of course came with the advent of movies and documentaries, and the Nazis themselves actually did a lot of that for their own purposes as well. So anyway, the reason I'm bringing this up is that I found a lot of the time the argument that is made to either not say that this is genocide, or maybe downplay it, or even just try and avoid it altogether. Someone would bring it up on a panel, and you can almost see the presenter or the host or whatever almost immediately feel uncomfortable and say, well, the Israelis would dispute these allegations, or immediately go to kind of these talking points in many ways. And I think part of it is editorial policy. The bosses say so, et cetera, the politics of the BBC, and so on and so forth, which is not as interesting for this conversation. I do get into it elsewhere. But another part of it is just, I think functionally, a lot of people just cannot imagine, or don't have the tools maybe, to understand or to imagine like genocides can also occur without the cartoonishly evil characters goose stepping like the Nazis did, in Germany and whatnot. Of course, we have the Bosnian genocide, the Rwandan genocide, and whatnot, that would have like these resonances and resemblances to the Holocaust, but not necessarily like you cannot necessarily tick all of the boxes, and yet they're still considered genocides. Let me ask you this: in your experience, what has been, with regards to the Gaza genocide specifically, how has it been talked about, specifically in connection to this conversation, in terms of not just intent, but with comparisons to the Holocaust, and how, of course, that can be very sensitive, all of that stuff.
Look, in the minds of Israelis, October 7th has no context. It could not be explained by anything, but it can explain anything afterwards.
Right.
But that's wrong. We have to understand the context. Like it doesn't have a context, and it's the right context for understanding what happened. I mean, it's a kind of a self-deception, But the 7th of October, of course, it had a context. But the 7th of October was a huge blow to us Israelis. It was a trauma. Those were heinous crimes. I can also say, and I say it always, it was also very personal. I knew people taken hostage, killed, their communities were completely destroyed. And there was a sense of self-defense afterwards. Now, I wanted to try to write, and I mean, it took me almost half a year to find my words again. But I wanted to say then, to write, and I didn't publish it anywhere, that, look, yes, we were hit very hard, and more than some 800 civilians were killed, and children were killed, and that was a crime. But at this particular moment, history tells us and teaches us that in such moments, those are the most dangerous moments in history, because you can become very quickly genocidal because of revenge and because of self-righteousness and because of the right of self-defense. And this is exactly what happens in almost all genocides. Most of the genocide, put the Holocaust aside, I will talk in a second on the Holocaust. If you look at Bosnia, you look at like Srebrenica or the whole Bosnia, or the atrocities in Bosnia, let's put it within the many Yugoslavian wars, and then also in Kosovo, and in Myanmar, or in Rwanda, or the Armenians you just mentioned, because these genocide or mass atrocities or crimes that were done by the stronger party were intrigued by this sense of self-defense. Self-defense is not exclusionary of crimes, but it is a motive of crime. When you feel you were hit so hard, you allow yourself, the stronger party allows itself, because it's always a matter of life and death, and now you have to annihilate your enemy. And then you reach levels of violence that were not foreseen before. But we have this cartoonish image about the Holocaust that are pure evil, and pure genocide must be enacted between two parties, one complete evil and one complete innocent. Now, in the case of the Holocaust, it's pretty much true, because there was no real conflict between the Jews and the Germans. On the contrary, German Jews in Germany, now then it expanded to the whole Europe, were very loyal, and the grosso modo wished to assimilate and contribute to this culture, and were patriots, and they fought in the First World War. So there was no real dispute between them. But if we take like the Armenians and the Ottoman and Turks at the Ottoman Empire, there was a dispute, because the Armenian nationalists wanted some kind of self-defense, and since the end of the 19th century, third of the 19th century, there were really also violent clashes between them. So most of the times there is a dispute between those parties. Same for the Hutu and Tutsi in Rwanda. And actually, the Tutsi committed real atrocities and crimes against the Hutu in Rwanda and outside of Rwanda at that time. But this is when most of genocides happen, when one is attacked and it has the capacity to annihilate and, quote unquote, solve the problem once and for all. In this sense, instead of developing our historical sensitivity to violence, Holocaust memory actually blocked us from understanding history and being sensitive and cautious about political violence, because we say, it's not the Holocaust, it's not genocide, it's okay, we can go along with it. And we have to, and then you put the intent card. You don't have like this kind of genocide where, a full-scale genocide in a sense that every Jew was to be annihilated with the intent, anti-Semitic intent by the by the Nazis. You don't have that. That's okay. That's, we've seen this a lot. That's not such a big deal, and we can go on with our lives. In this sense, we always said, look, we teach the Holocaust in order to be more sensitive to violence and human rights and mechanism of violence, so we can understand better and maybe prevent the next one. But in fact, what happened, that it blocks our understanding, because if we compare it always to the Holocaust and it's not the Holocaust, we say, it's okay. So in this sense, but if you look at what historians, and now I can say, there's a growing consensus among many, many legal scholars and human rights, like the most prestigious human rights bodies and NGOs, that it also adheres to the very strict Genocide Convention, the case of Gaza. So maybe it's not the Holocaust, it's at its own features, it's within a conflict, yes, but it is still a genocide according to what we understand in history as a genocide and what we understand in legal studies as a genocide. This is my understanding. We can talk afterwards about historians who understood this problematics and suggested drop, like someone like Dirk Moses, who suggested to drop the term of genocide because of what you said, it distorts our understanding, and we have to talk about some other term which you call permanent security in order to focus on when a state kills so many civilians, which is the crime. And this is what we want to understand, and this is what we want to prevent.
I was going to get into that point a bit later, but I'll mention it here because it's most directly related to what you just said, that a lot of this conversation for me, the questions of genocide and how they're talked about, the Assad regime, for those who don't know, I've mentioned this on this podcast a few times, has been accused, of course, by many actors of committing genocide. But the term that was used in a 2016, I believe, report by the UN is the extermination as a crime of humanity. So this is the actual sentence. These actions in the pursuance of a state policy amount to extermination as a crime against humanity. And that's in that report. And when it came to it, I think one of the consequences of a report like that one, and this was part of a much, much broader discourse, it was, of course, in 2016, which at the end of that year, there was the fall of Eastern Aleppo, which was one of the bloodiest battles and so on. It sort of felt that as long as some inaction or the action of a state, cannot be described as genocide with almost like a capital G, it's not as severe, it's not as serious, it's not like the ultimate crime. And that's why for me, from the early days, even as early as basically a decade ago or so, I started questioning a lot why there is such an importance on attributing a crime against humanity, which, as far as I'm concerned, is horrible enough, with this hierarchy of what is considered worse than another. And I'm not saying that there aren't hierarchies of crimes, there are, but I'm talking in terms of the label of it all. So if a crime against humanity like this, the extermination, as the UN called it, by the Assad regime, which the death toll over these 13 years, of course, up until its fall in December of 2024, reasonably is in the hundreds of thousands. Some report even put it in the higher hundreds of thousands. We probably will never have a final death toll. If that cannot be described as genocide with a capital G, but can still be described as a crime against humanity, at what point is the term genocide as being the only thing that matters very problematic, if that makes sense? And whereas I personally see a lot of reason to argue, and of course you do as well, that the actions of the Israelis, of the Israeli military and state in Gaza is in fact a genocide, there's still a part of me that wonders, what if it wasn't one, but it was quote unquote just a crime against humanity, an extermination a la Assad, basically? Would that be less serious in the international discourse and according to the international community and whatnot? And it leads to very uncomfortable conclusions, I feel. If it's kind of these two things at the same time. On the one hand, the burden of proof to determine in legal terms whether something has intent, whether there is intent, is very high and quasi-impossible in many cases, which already lets off the hook actors like the Israeli government in this case. And even if there wasn't that entire conversation in the first place, like in the case of the Assad regime, it kind of like doubly lets it off the hook. Like it's not even that. And therefore it's not even worth the attention that if we called it a genocide, that it would, be as important, if that makes sense. This is more philosophical, I guess, or whatever, but I would be curious as a historian, how do you think about that?
We can unpack this problem. On the one hand, and this is something that was discussed before, there's a kind of a competition that in order to break into public opinion and to international diplomacy and to international courts, you have to elevate in a way the crime that was committed against you and compare it to the Holocaust and say it's a genocide. While sometimes many more kills, like in the Vietnam War, it is estimated, I think, that United States killed in Southeast Asia 2 million civilians. Is that less severe, less punishable, less a crime if it could not, as you say, adhere to the convention and its legal definition of genocide? This is a real problem, and as I mentioned, because of that, one of the main historians in the field, Dirk Moses, wrote recently. It was published, like I think 2 years ago, a book, "The Problems of Genocide," which means not only the genocide is a problem, of course, of annihilating groups and killing so many people and so on and so forth, but the problem of the very concept that, as you said, it somehow makes hierarchy between crimes according to whether they fit some kind of a definition that was decided upon in 1948 by some political powers, the international powers, and undoubtedly that's a big problem. I think I'm not familiar enough with the Syrian case, unfortunately, but I think since the amount of killing and annihilation and also certain groups were targeted, it it could fall, certainly it could fall within the, I think, I don't want to be decisive, but it falls within this understanding of genocide, particularly if you think of genocide as a crime or an event or a process. I think we should call it a process of annihilating groups, not necessarily the entire group, but the group, by annihilating some of it, by destroying it, and therefore maybe perhaps the Syrian case is also relevant. I should say, for example, that whether it was a genocide or not a genocide, or there was an exhibition, for example, for a pretty long time at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum on Syria, because whether it is or not a genocide, they understood it's the same family of crimes. The enormity of the crime. Now, how do we cope with this competition, quote unquote, on this to be considered, for events to be considered a genocide, because then they are a crime of crimes? That's I think a question, and we cannot completely solve. I don't think we have to give up this term, because it does sets it. For example, one of the most famous books in the field by Samantha Power, who then became in the Biden administration, but a problem for her, she called it the crime of crimes, and some of the international legal tribunals discussed it also called it the crime of crime, like it's a special, very severe crime. But not all agree with that. It's just a crime, a certain kind of a crime, and it's not worse than, as you said, crime against humanity is on big scale, and we should not hierarchize these crimes. But I think what this term, we should not drop it all together, despite all the difficulties. And you said, but we cannot solve all problems. It's always a kind of a trade-off, what you gain and what you lose when you use a term. So I think it does focus us to certain, not only crimes, but political processes of annihilating a group, rather many individuals. This is for me the essence or the core. I think this was also the core for Raphael Lemkin, which I mentioned at the beginning of our talk. very simple way and commonsensical way. Genocide is the attempt or sometimes success to annihilate a group, not only many individuals. And maybe it's more severe, maybe it's not, maybe it's crime of crimes or not crimes of crimes. I don't care about it. But it's a special kind of dealing with your enemy in a conflict when you actually want to annihilate it, whether to kill all its members or to annihilate it as a group. And sometimes crimes against humanity on huge scale may not be genocide, but they were really as even worse than genocide. But still, genocide enable us to focus on this kind of political violence that does not just want to, I would say, beat the enemy or self-defense, but to annihilate or to annihilate completely the group. And I think it's very important to keep this term because it signifies to this kind of radical violence, which is very common in modern times and particularly in certain political and historical contexts. I hope I answered. There's no good answer to it. And in
No.
our world, there are never clear-cut answers. You always, when you use a term, you always have to ask what you win and what you lose. And of course, you get into some conceptual and moral, in this case, problems. But still, I would keep it.
Yeah, I agree. It's not so much that I think the term itself is not useful. It's more the de facto hierarchy that is created when a crime can be described as everything but that. As that,
Yes.
Therefore, that crime, as you mentioned, Vietnam is of course a big example as well, or the Syrian one that I mentioned. Interestingly enough, this does lead us pretty well to the next point, which is that. Let me see if I can introduce this to listeners decently enough, because you in the paper there's a warning that you make effectively, and here I'll quote parts of what you said, that at the question of this forum lies the question of whether the field of Holocaust and genocide studies is currently in crisis in light of the events in Gaza. And then you make the argument that, like, if the question of intent, and here I'm quoting, the dominance of which is rooted in legal discourse, we've talked about this in this chat so far, takes over Holocaust and genocide studies, then it will push us back decades. And you mentioned that in the context of Gaza and the broader Israeli-Palestinian context, the historical seems to be collapsing into the legal, which, we've gotten into this already. But what I'm curious is, this was published in October of last year, 2024. Is it fair to say that as far as like Holocaust and genocide studies as a field is concerned, things have gotten worse? This is the end of part 1. In part 2, we start with Professor Goldberg answering this question regarding the warning that he put in that paper. We then discuss an open letter that was released at the end of 2023, in which Holocaust scholars who previously had said that the Holocaust cannot be compared to any other genocide seemed more than willing to compare Hamas to the Nazis and to compare the October 7th massacre to the Holocaust. We took the opportunity after discussing that letter to talk about the importance of a field like comparative genocide studies, and how trying to understand how genocides compare to one another is not the same as relativizing them and diminishing their uniqueness in many ways. If anything, it makes our understanding of genocides much more nuanced and richer. The last bit of that conversation of part 2, we got into the book The Holocaust and the Nakba, which Professor Goldberg edited with Professor Bashir, on the importance of recognizing two stories that have come to dominate the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict. The Holocaust, of course, and the Nakba. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you already want to listen to that full episode, it is already available on patreon.com/fromtheperiphery for free. Otherwise, on the public feeds, part 2 will be released in a week. Thank you all for listening.